going back to the office and clinging to that as a central theme that's going to guide us through the work that we're doing. And so the way in which we want to start with that is to think about our change and joy model. And for those of you that have followed us, you've seen this before, which is that as change happens, how that change impacts people has an impact on the culture of the people as well, not just the thing that's getting done, but on the culture more broadly. And how that culture goes wraps back around to how change is going to go in the future as well. And when those are going well, you get a positive cycle. A positive change positively impacts the culture, which then positively impacts the next change. But it can also happen negatively. And unfortunately, I'm sure all of you have experienced that as well. Change doesn't go so well. And by that, I mean its impact on the culture. It can go well for the operational part. You may put in the new system, make the merger happen. You hit all of the goals as intended, but people still look back on it and talk about the broken bodies and the bruises that occurred as a result of the work. And so the culture has been damaged. And so that means that the next change that comes along is going to be more and more difficult. And then out to the right, you see the 10 dimensions that we've identified as the indicators of joy at work. And trust is right here at the top. We kick this off with a view of trust. And what we want to do with all of this is come back to those 10 dimensions. And for this presentation, we'll focus in on trust in particular, but the others are certainly applicable as well. All right, so I've said trust a bunch. This is what we mean by trust. Trust is my willingness to risk being dependent on others for my personal success. And so we have a very different view of trust than many people have. Many people use the phrase that trust has to be earned. You have to earn my trust. We flip that around the other way, and that trust needs to be given. So I, as a leader, need to give my trust to others. So that's where it comes back to our definition here. That trust then is my willingness, by doing that, to risk being dependent on others for my personal success. So I've given my trust, and now I'm at risk because I'm dependent on others for my personal success. But as a leader in particular, if I don't do that, then trust is not really something that's growing the culture. Trust is a test. If you have to earn my trust, then I'm simply testing you, waiting for you to either fail or do something that somehow in my eyes indicates that you are worthy of me working with you further. And we think that's completely backwards. You need to lend your trust, give it, and show your willingness to risk being dependent on someone else. So with that in mind, let's get into the meat of what we're going to be talking about here. So it's really these three things. We're going to talk about this idea of visual perception and just how valuable that is in terms of human cognitive ability and how much of it is really wrapped around how we see. And then we'll take that over into data visualization. So how do we use data then to start to get insights? And then from there, set up the notion of the story. And what I want to thread through this is the idea of presentations in terms of going back to the office. There is a story that we ultimately are trying to get to, if you're going to try and build joy at work, a story about why the office is worthy to go back to. What is the value of going back to the office and then being able to use that now as a tool that's going to help your organization, as opposed to we're just setting a firm date, everyone's got to be back in the office, and if you're not there, you're fired. Well, that's a very different approach. That is not going to grow joy at work. It may get people back into the office, but it's not likely to accomplish a cultural strengthening that's then going to make each subsequent change that you take on better. It's going to do the opposite. It's going to make each subsequent change that you take on even more difficult. So the big idea here, of course, is that a picture is worth 1,000 words. People have been saying that for a long time, but let's talk about why that's true. Like, is it literally true? It is actually pretty close to literally true. And it has to wrap around this idea of visual perception. Depending on how you measure, as much as a third of the human brain is wrapped around visual perception. I don't mean the part where light comes into the eye, stimulates the optic nerve, and then sends electrical impulses into your brain. That, of course, is important, but that's really the core central part of it. What's wrapped around all of that is the perception part. How do people take that on and then use that perception in the understanding of the world around them? And that's the part that we really want to be able to try and tap into. That's where the power is going to come. So in a simple example, if I gave you this list of data and asked you to tell me what's going on, you eventually figure it out. I mean, you go through and read through it and you start to be able to pull some things and make some comparisons. But if I visualize the data and give it to you like this, you can see it much faster than you can analyze it. You immediately see that it's in 3 clusters of companies that are on the rocket ship to what's considered a hot company to what's considered a slow burner, the blue ones. You could see the range of the dollar data, which is the growth history and revenue, going all the way up to 250 million. And you can see the timeline goes out to 30 years. And you could see the basic spread of that data. And you saw all of that way faster than I was able to explain it to you. And even more fast than what you would have been able to get if you just looked at the data on the right. Humans can see much faster than they can analyze. So here's another example. So taking a look at this and taking it in, it would certainly help a bit if you spoke French. But what's wonderful about this example is 2 things, really. One, that it is the earliest one that I've been able to find that's a great visual depiction of a bunch of data. So this was done in the 19th century. It's a depiction of Napoleon's march on Moscow. And so the tan line is both an indicator over the land. It shows the actual cities that Napoleon and his army went through. But the size of that tan line also shows you the number of men in Napoleon's army. And so you can see that it's getting smaller as they go further and further into Russia, all the way to Moscow. And then the black line shows the retreat. Again, the cities that Napoleon and his army passed. But again, you can see the number of men in the army are decreasing because the size of that black line is also decreasing. And if you go down below to the bottom of the depiction, you can see temperatures. And if you look closely, you'll notice that the temperatures all have minus signs in front of them. It is very cold during this time. And what this is helping us to see is that Napoleon lost a considerable portion of his army, but not to combat. He lost the army to weather and sickness. And because it was so cold, that impact on his army, as you can see from this depiction, was tremendous. What's also interesting about this one is this is, of course, 150 years before there were any computers. So this is all hand drawn, but it takes a lot of information and nicely lays it out on a single view. And so someone looking at it can see rapidly what is going on with what happened in this particular historical event. And I love this quote from Florence Nightingale. To affect through the eyes what we fail to convey to the public through their word-proof ears. I think word-proof ears are an amazing phraseology to use with how people understand things. So many people know that Florence Nightingale was a nurse. She was engaged in the Crimea conflict with the British Army, and a particular area of specialization was really cleanliness, sanitation. And she was sent in to look at the hospitals that were there and to be part of what was becoming a growing movement around cleansing and disinfecting places where people were receiving medical procedures or even just where they were recovering. And that was a dramatic improvement in saving lives. Florence Nightingale went back to the UK, Britain back then, and was a social reformer. But what many people don't know is that she was a statistician as well. And I mean a for real statistician. She was the first female member of the British Royal Statistical Society. And she was also a member of the American Statistical Society, and did real work around using data and visualizing data to be able to tell a story about what's going on. So let's get into data visualization. I've used that term a few times, and there's some tips and tricks that we will talk about as we go through all of this. But really what we want to get to is think of this in terms of interpretation. So Edward Tufte in the early 80s wrote some of the beginning very core books that have now been used for decades about data visualization. You can see the visual display of quantitative information was one of his first. And his area of emphasis here was this idea to reveal the data. And what he meant by that was use the visualization so that whoever is observing it, reading the visualization, can actually understand what's going on with the data. So he urged us to show the data as both the trend as well as individual data points. And the idea was to get people to really think about what is going on here, what the substance is, not how is the data collected or what's this interesting way in which we are presenting the data, but really ultimately to focus on this notion of comparison. And the reason for that is that humans are very good at qualitative analysis. Being able to make comparisons is something more or less, taller or shorter. Humans are terrible at quantitative analysis. So if you put two people together, you would quickly know and be able to say who is taller than the other one. But you would be less accurate if you were to try and come up with an exact quantitative height for each of those two people. And so this idea of comparison is really a core around ideas in data visualization. Tufte went on to lay out these four areas as well, recommendations really. And it's interesting because they're being well taken on today. So the first thing he said was offer a pre-read, distribute a pre-read, have people take 5 to 10 minutes to read through what you've put together. And this is precisely what Amazon and now other companies have started to take on. They generate a document, a old school memo style document, and spend the beginning of the meeting asking everyone in the meeting to read it and take in what's there and then begin the discussion. He suggested that making all of this around self-discovery, so really having the people viewing the data visualization to be able to draw their own insights from it, and to focus that around comparison. Because what he's ultimately trying to get everybody to is the ability to actually be able to discuss. And that word discussion actually has a specific meaning. If you really want to look at the etymology of the word, it means to shake up and shake things apart. So when you're discussing, you're really trying to understand what is going on with this. So he's pushing against is don't set up a data visualization that basically says this is the answer. What he's saying is create a data visualization and a story around the presentation that talks about the substance of what's going on so that the people viewing it can then engage in a discussion to come up with the answer, to be able to group process to get to a better answer. So let's just look at an example. So let's say we're looking at this as an example of some change metrics. There's a change going on, in this case, a CEO swap out. And this is the survey response data that's been gathered. So just 5 questions that are here, and we're scoring them or have them score them on somewhat of a Likert scale, definitely, mostly, somewhat, not at all. And then we're presenting that data across these 5 questions. And there's a bunch that you can gather from this, because you can see from the coloration that's there that question 3 has not at all answers where the others do not, because you can see the yellow slice and not the others. And you can see size of slices. So question 1's got the biggest green slice that's in there, mostly is more than the others. Questions 4 and 5 have bigger blue slices at the definitely. So there's quite a bit that you can gather. But setting it up as pie charts is difficult because pie charts are not easy to compare to each other. And so that actually goes against what we're trying to advocate here with data visualization in terms of comparison. And instead, if I take the very same data and reformat it into this form, you can see some things right away. Like number 1, not everybody answered all the questions. That would have been almost impossible to figure out in the pie chart without literally adding up the numbers themselves that showed up there. So we could see that questions 2 and 3 did not get answers from everyone. And we can see that rapidly because the size of the bars are just shorter. We don't have as many responses. But we're able to compare much better now as a result of setting this up. And so it's easier to see the definitelys and mostlys, see where the not at alls show up, and get a better view as to really what's going on, because this presentation allows for comparison. And comparison is really the thing that we want to try and focus in on when we're trying to come up with the information that we need and try and pass that along to others. Google has these 6 rules for data visualization, which I think make for a pretty good rubric for judging what is good and what isn't. So the first thing is be honest. So they focus in on the ideas of accuracy, and make sure that there's nothing going on that confuses somebody or starts to clearly drive in a particular way, show some level of partiality. And then they look for ways in which to help people out. So build ways for people to move through the data in a way that allows them to understand what's going on. Don't make them have to puzzle through it. Make it obvious how the data is put together. And if you can, delight the people that are there. So give them a little bit of polish, show a little bit of innovation. Maybe you might look for things that provide a dynamic view. Could be as simple as filters that allow people to pick what it is that they're looking at, or it could be more dynamic elements that are taking them through part of the story. Try and make sure that you are reducing the cognitive load, which means don't throw everything in there. So be selective. So that's potentially in tension with the idea of being accurate, being honest. So don't hide things from people, but then don't give them everything so that there's such clutter, it's very difficult to figure out what's going on. Be careful about scale and make sure that you can have scale so that comparison is possible. So when people are truncating axes, that can be a dangerous practice. You want to be careful with that. And then lastly, provide some structure, some way in which people can understand the hierarchy that's there, if there is such a hierarchy, ordering the data so that it's easy to understand from big to little or little to big. Again, focusing in on this idea of comparison. So there are a number of chart types that you could possibly use. And what I want to do is go through a review of these chart types and do it in a way that starts to help us think about this whole idea of going back to the office and how we might tell that story. So we'll walk through some of these and talk also about how they would actually be used in that context to go back to the office. So the first, we're just looking at this. If we had mostly continuous data and we wanted to show changes through time, what would be the best way to go about doing that? Well, a way to do that would be these charts, right? A line chart or an area chart are the most obvious ones because time can then be depicted going left to right. You can see what happens with it as we move through all of those, but then also be able to show multiple different items so that there's a comparison of them through time. So examples of this, as we start to think about this notion of go back to the office, is productivity and even revenue, if that's something that's even easier to show, and be able to demonstrate where that has dipped as a result of being remote, right? So going back to the office implies that there's some value to go back to the office. So whatever that value is, we're going to try and show that there's been a dip in that value through time as people have gone remote as a result of the pandemic. And that although people may view themselves as particularly productive, they may not be able to see that that is true collectively for the entire group. In fact, a useful thing to show might be amount of hours worked versus the output that the company needs, because people are feeling the increase in the hours that they're working as a result of this remote work, but not necessarily seeing that they're not as effective as they used to be. If we were looking at things that are discrete data, and we really want to show the kind of categorization here, but we want to be able to do a comparison of the amounts in these categories. What kind of a chart do we want to choose there? Well, in that case, going to a bar chart is going to probably be the best way to go. Some of these others are useful as well, but a stack bar chart in particular is a way to be able to pull each of these individual things together to show where they are. And again, if we're trying to show something in terms of productivity, this might be a way to be able to show what's going on. We could, for example, look at different groups within the company, especially if we've got groups that are fully in the office, partly in the office, fully remote, and show differences in the productivity that the people that are in the office are able to obtain. And of course, that means they have to actually have some productivity increase as a result of being in the office, which gets into a whole other stream around being thoughtful and intentional about how you're using the office. We'll come to that later, but if we're able to show those differences, this sort of categorical comparison is the place where that's going to show up. And a bar chart's an excellent way to go about doing that. And a view or sort of nuance to that kind of comparison chart is a ranking chart. And we're just really looking at the same thing, but we're trying to show it from large to small or small to large. And this is particularly useful for the Pareto 80-20 rule, or find that a good portion of the value or the thing that we're interested in, the amount of it, is going to be shifted to one particular part of the distribution as opposed to the other. And that can be easily shown if we actually rank them. So it's just similar to the categorical comparison, but we're just ordering them. If we wanted to show truly discrete data and we want to show a comparison of an individual part to the whole, then what might we take a look at there? Well, and that is the one place that I would suggest using a pie chart, and really the only place that I would suggest using a pie chart. Even from there, better things around sunburst and even a tree map are probably actually going to be better than a pie chart because they have more dimensions that you can show. But we can use a pie chart to be able to show this. And again, thinking about the idea of using the office again, this could be a good place to show where people are spending their time. So one of the reports that's out often now is that people are in more meetings. It's, online video meeting after video meeting. It would be interesting to show that, and then perhaps to show then also a comparison. So use a stack bar chart to show the difference between what's going on today versus what was going on 2 or 3 years ago. And what is revealed, at least studies are showing this, is that people are spending more time in meetings and having to do them largely in 30-minute increments. And as a result of that, filling up their day. And so they are in meetings more often than they used to be 2-3 years ago before the pandemic. But the productivity is going down because there's so much of an emphasis on this kind of communication that's not necessarily the most valuable. And so it's a way to demonstrate that and to show that that sort of 5-minute, oh, by the way, conversation that happens in an office that doesn't typically happen in a video setting is where some of that productivity loss can be recaptured. Correlation charts are really about statistical comparison. So now we're trying to get a lot of data points and show what's going on with a lot of data points and be able to make comparisons with all of those. This could be really useful if we start to think about retention reasons. So what are the reasons that people stay, reasons that people go? So the reasons people stay, gathering through a survey, reasons that they go, gathering through an exit interview, and be able to show the statistical distribution of that and what correlates to what. So what are the things that are really driving people? And again, if you start to think about the use of the office and its impact on culture, trying to get to how does the office impact culture? There's a lot of pushback from employees generally about going back to the office for obvious reasons: commute time, the ability to work with their family and deal with what's been going on with the pandemic, everything from homeschool to all sorts of other things that need to be taken care of that are easier to do if you're home. But if we're able to look at what really drives a culture and what's encouraging people to stay and encouraging people to go, a correlation chart that looks at some of the statistics is helpful. Distribution chart will show up with that as well, just to be able to show broadly what all the reasons are and how often they show up. We can look at flow charts. The sand key, as an example, connects back to the chart of Napoleon's march on Moscow. Gantt charts are typically used for project plans, but one that might be more valuable here is a network chart. And as we start to think about going back to the office, what has happened to the network of people's connections as a result of being remote? And studies are showing that they're becoming thinner. The networks are thinner. There are less connections. If you're to ask people a simple question around who do you actually even know within a group, there's going to be a lot of disconnected people because people have been hired in the last couple of years and they haven't met everyone that's within their group. Maybe some on video chats, but very little in person, or certainly less. And then ask people, in addition to that, how connected are you? Which could be a simple question around how often do you have a conversation with them? Once a day, many times a day, once a week, and use that as a judgment around how connected the network is. It's very easy to do. I do something very similar to that every year in my undergrad analytics class. So I can see how connected the class is and actually use that information to pick teams to do projects. The same idea is going to apply in the workplace as well. How connected are people is an indication of how well they're able to work together. And if they don't have connections with each other, then it becomes harder and harder to work together. Relationship charts kind of give us both a comparison and a relation. You can see categories. The Venn chart is something that gets used a lot with that as well. But really what we want to get down to are how are we just using all this stuff? And so the rules of a great data visualization kind of come back to Tufte. And again, I'm going to talk about revealing the data. We want to set it up so that we reveal the data. And in order to do that well, we want to start with a question or a hypothesis. And that's super important for any analysis, but certainly true here as well, is to start with what are we trying to answer? Because if you have that, and you can look at the analysis that you've done and say, yes, I have actually answered that question. Now you know you're done. That is how you know you're done, because you've answered the question, and that reduces, if not eliminates, this process of analysis paralysis. We want to create comparison and use comparison as a way for us to look at the various data elements and make sure that that comparison readily comes through by not including anything that we don't need for the story. So in this depiction here, we see a map. And this is a map that's put together by John Snow, also back in the 19th century. John Snow was a physician working in a hospital in London, and there was a cholera outbreak. And at the time, what the recommendations were for cholera was to close your doors and windows to keep the bad air out, which would not have helped at all, or to move out into the country, which actually would have helped, but for a different reason. And Snow was the one that figured it out. And the way that he did that was by looking at the people that were in the hospital with cholera and then plotting the number of people by address. So the black lines that you see on the depiction are essentially bar charts at the address that hold the number of people that have cholera at the address. And as you can see in this depiction, there are a lot of black bars that are pretty centrally located in one spot in London. And what Snow discovered was that they were all pulling from the same water source, the same well. And that was what led to the discovery that cholera is actually waterborne and not airborne. And so closing doors and windows didn't matter at all. What was needed was to use another water source or clean up the water source that was there. And that was discovered through the use of data visualization in this depiction that you see here. So comparison is really the central theme that I want to leave you with here. If you do nothing at all, think in terms of data visualization as comparison. And so if we're going to think about this notion of going back to the office, to make the case that there's value there, you're going to have to compare where we are now to where you were when you were still using the office to make an argument via data visualization that going back to the office is actually going to be valuable and useful for your team. So the last piece I want to get to here then is actually telling the story and thinking about how we pull that story together to be able to make a truly persuasive presentation. And this is really about movement from data to information to knowledge. So data is all the statistics that you grab, all the data points themselves. Information is when you start to take that data and do some basic analysis with it. And knowledge is the feedback that you get after you've made a decision based off of that information, and now have some feedback as to the quality of the actual output that you got. So all of that is trying to wrap around this idea of staying away from the narrative fallacy. And this comes from Nassim Nicholas Taleb's book, The Black Swan. And here's his quote: "Think of the world around you, laden with trillions of details. Try to describe it, and you will find yourself tempted to weave a thread into what you are saying. A novel, a story, a myth, or a tale all have the same function. They spare us from the complexity of the world and shield us from its randomness." What he's getting at is this whole idea of, hey, trust me, I have experience, is not the area that we want to get to, or we want to be able to get to is take the data, have that reveal what is really going on to give us information, and then be able to go make a decision and implement from there. Because otherwise, the natural human tendency is going to be to create a narrative around what is going on and to drive forward on that narrative. And it's the use of data in analyzing it, in this case in particular, visualizing it, that's going to help us stay away from the narrative fallacy and be able to drive to something that's really going to be productive and useful for us and help us make a good decision. And the way in which to go about thinking about telling that compelling story is to contemplate, what do you want people to know? What do you want people to do? And how do you want people to feel as a result of the presentation you put together? So, no, I want people to know that as a group, we are not as productive as we used to be when we were in the office. And what I want you to feel is some urgency around trying to remedy that, and some confidence maybe that going back to the office will be both safe and valuable for the cost and effort that's going to be associated with starting to commute again. And what do I want you to do? I want you to start planning more about how you're going to use the office, planning about how you're going to change your life to be able to re-engage with the office, and then execute on that against this particular timeline as an example of how you want to pull people through all of that. Because if you don't do that, if you don't think about this sort of flow of know, deal, do, and feel, and how all those are going to come together, it'll be very difficult to keep your presentation locked in and directed, and even more difficult to choose what are the things that you're going to visualize to be able to drive people to this. The way to go and make sure that you don't have too much stuff in your presentation is to make sure that every element is helping you to do one of these three things. So that takes us back to our change and joy model. And again, thinking about doing this in a way that helps the change go well. Going back to the office is certainly a large change. How that change has an impact on the culture, on the level of joy at work. And in particular, looking at all the pieces that are here, trust being a key one. So it can seem like managers and leaders don't trust their employees when you say, I want you back in the office, because it's an easy narrative to put together that you want me back in the office so you could see that I'm actually there and see if I'm at work, because you don't trust me. If what you're trying to do is increase the quality of your culture, you're going to have to lend trust to the people, be willing to be vulnerable and at risk by giving them that trust. And to do that then means to understand what the impact of this change is to them and to manage that change well. And by doing that, you increase your culture, you grow joy at work. So those things have to come together to form a complete package. That's what we're trying to get at with being able to present the data in a powerful way. All right, so as a quick recap then, think in terms of comparison. So qualitative is easier to absorb than quantitative. You want to really think about the visuals. What are you picking? Bar charts or line charts or whatever. So those design elements, whatever you put on that page, really have an impact on the perception that people have, how they take it all in. And then lastly, know what reaction you want from people, know what you want them to know, feel, and do. And use that as a way to focus in the presentation so that every element has something that is driving towards one of those three pieces that get you really to the outcome that you're looking for. All right, well, our next webinar then towards the end of the month in 2 weeks will be communicating the change with empathy, in particular, the change to go back to the office. So how do we take what we've learned here and then include that in a larger package of communication to be able to get back to the office with your team in a way that drives your culture to grow joy at work? As a highlight here, we want to talk about give you something that you can use to help yourself out. This self-reflection guide around joy at work is something that we're offering for just $2. And we're not even taking the money. We're going to donate the money either to the Ukrainian Red Cross or the Juvenile Diabetes Research Foundation, which is an organization that's close to me, and or to Ricky's Refuge, which is an animal shelter operation that's fantastic here in Virginia, that's close to Roxanne's heart. And so you can pick which of those three that are there, and we'll donate that money forward to them. But the Joy at Work self-reflection guide will help you think about these elements around culture for yourself and for your team, and those will be elements that'll fit well within a persuasive presentation. And that's it. So thank you so much for hanging out with me to think about some of these things. We find that they're really useful for people to kind of pull all of them together. And if you're interested in more, we've got a few things coming up for those of you who are Association of Change Management Professional members. On the conference coming up next month, we have 2 sessions in there, one on calculating a change ROI, and one on how artificial intelligence is going to impact change management. So a little bit of the hype and a little bit of the hope in there. And then in August, we'll be doing a webinar through ACMP about how to pull your team up when it is down, when your culture is suffering. And it's really the foundation story for the change decision and how Roxanne and I came to even think that putting the change decision together and this idea of joy at work would be something that would be valuable for the rest of the folks to take on. So here is how you could stay in touch with us, either via email or taking a look at what we're writing and get a taste of some of the other ideas that we have in there. We're trying to be very regular about all those and make sure we have those things to share. All right, my friends, thank you very much for spending some time with us. We enjoy getting the chance to do all of these and love being able to have folks be able to come together with us and share them. So thanks, and hope to see you at the next one.